the decisions that we make on our forests through forest management and specifically adaptation will have an impact on how our forests can adapt to climate change. And so adaptation is one way to respond to environmental change and promote sustainable practices in forest management. Specifically, it's used to better cope with, manage, or adjust to changing conditions. So this may involve reducing the impact of climate-related events, so installing culverts, for example, to reduce the impact of extreme precipitation events, or it could be increasing the capacity of the forest system to recover from shocks. So this could be thinking about different tree species that might be well-suited for a future climate, and so the forest would then have the ability to recover from changes later due to shifts in species composition. However, despite this growing interest in different adaptation strategies among scientists, researchers, policymakers, there is still differential adoption by forest stakeholders. So not all forest managers and owners are doing climate change adaptation. And there's also different adaptation strategies that are more favored than others. And so it's important that we understand why that is and how we can think about eliciting broad support for adaptation within Maine and across the Northeast. And so this is where communication comes in. And so there's increasing recognition that just increasing knowledge about adaptation or climate change won't necessarily lead to increasing in adaptation strategies or sustainable forest management. So we need to think about some bigger things going on here. And so what's important is to think about two-way communication and engagement. And so appealing to an individual's social norms, their values, what they care most about, and their experiences are all really important for engaging them in a discussion about climate change and about adaptation on their forests. We also need to think about the fact that there are different stakeholder groups. There are small woodlot owners, there are those working in the government, those working for the commercial forestry or larger industry, and all of these different stakeholders have different values. They care about different things, they manage their forests for different reasons, and so they may require different message frames to address their specific needs and perceptions. So the purpose of this study was to compare perceptions of forest professionals and small woodlot owners to determine some different message frames that connect with both groups as well as individual groups to increase support for adaptation. And when I talk about forest professionals, I'm talking about mainly those working in large industry versus small woodlot owners, have fewer employees, usually manage a smaller acreage. And so those are kind of how we're thinking about the two groups in this study. And so specific questions we wanted to answer were, how do climate change risk perceptions, sociocultural influences, so those are your social norms and your values, perceptions of self-efficacy, barriers and incentives to adaptation, where you get your information, and different management actions. So how do those compare among those two groups? We're also interested in how different communication messages or message frames can be used to connect with these audiences. So before I get into it, just some conceptual foundations, just some background. When we're talking about climate change risk perceptions, we're talking about different factors that might influence those risk perceptions and then in turn influence behavior. And so we're using the climate change risk perceptions model developed by van der Linden. And so this essentially states that there are different factors. So knowledge, that's your cognitive factors, knowledge about the causes of climate change, the impacts of climate change, and how to respond. Those all influence your perceptions of risk, as well as your experiences. So have you experienced extreme weather events, and do you have negative emotions associated with those experiences? And then that would increase your risk perceptions. We're also thinking about sociocultural influences, so social norms. So do people you care about believe in climate change? Do they think that you should adapt to climate change? Also, we're thinking about values. So do you care about the environment? Do you care about others? Those are some broad value orientations. And then finally, we have some sociodemographics that have been shown to influence perceptions of risk. So what's your position? How old are you? What's your experience, your gender, your political affiliation? And the reason we're interested in risk perceptions or perceived risk is because that has been shown to influence behavior. So intention to engage in adaptive management, for example. And one other point, so when we're talking about risk perceptions, we're talking about the subjective risk perception. So this is separate than actual risk. This is subjective risk. So regardless if there's a risk, we're more interested in what you think about that risk, in this case, climate change. So I mentioned earlier, we're talking about Maine. And so Maine has a highly diverse forest system, over 50 tree species. You can see we have 3 broad climate divisions, coastal, southern interior, and northern. Within the state, forestry supports more than 30,000 jobs and has an economic impact of over $8 billion. So the forest industry is very important to Maine's economy, but also just socially within the state. Forestry is very important for tourism, recreation, community, social well-being. Also, I just want to point out, Maine is a little bit unique because we have a high diversity of forest stakeholders. We have a high percentage of productive timberland in the country, and among that, a high percentage of that is owned by commercial and industry foresters. We also have government owned land, public land, private land, small woodlot owners. So given that high diversity of forest stakeholders, each of them bring their own perceptions, values, and management objectives. So to compare across groups, we did an online survey of 2 forest stakeholder groups. And those 2 groups, we emailed Maine Woodland Owners Association. And so from now on, I'm going to be referring them to just small woodlot owners. And we also emailed UMaine's Cooperative Forestry Research Unit, which is comprises the Forest Professionals Group. So the CFRU, for those unfamiliar, is a group of mostly land managers, landowners, and researchers that are interested in applied research and adaptive sustainable forest management. So we were able to get 190 complete responses from this survey. And we had several different measures within the survey that were measured on 5-point scales. So strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then those were used to get some mean scores, which I'll show you in a minute. And so some of the things that we measured, the questions of interest, included self-efficacy. So self-efficacy means that you believe in your ability to address climate change and to adapt to climate change. We also ask about their climate change risk perceptions, their norms and their values, where they get their information from, their perceived barriers and incentives to adaptation, and what they are willing to do on their land currently in terms of management strategies. And we're interested in all of these things, as I previously mentioned, because they can all influence adaptation implementation. Like I said, they were measured on 5-point Likert scales, and then we compared across stakeholder groups using independent samples t-tests. And so the first thing we're going to be talking about is self-efficacy. So this is their belief in your ability to do something, to carry out an action. And so 42% of forest professionals versus only 23% of small woodlot owners know what adaptation efforts to make regarding climate change impacts. So forest professionals are significantly more likely to know what adaptation efforts to make, but it's still low across both groups, less than 50%. 19% of forest professionals and 16% of small woodlot owners believe there is enough sufficient information available to understand climate change impacts on Maine's forests. So again, this number is small, indicating that the majority of folks don't think that there's enough information to understand climate change impacts. And finally, around 30% of both groups believe that there are specific management specific management practices available to help land managers adapt to climate change in Maine's forests. So this indicates maybe a perceived need for specific management guidelines to help adapt to climate change. Getting into climate change risk perceptions, high percentage, 75 and 78%, believe that climate change will have a significant impact on Maine's forest ecosystems within the next 50 years. A little less, but still high, believe that climate change will have a significant impact on Maine's forest industry within the next 50 years. And then a little less believe that climate change is a threat to forest ecosystems. So this is compared, previously it was believed that it will impact within the next 50 years. And now we have less thinking that climate change is an actual threat to forest ecosystems. Even less believe that climate change is a threat to the forest industry. And then even less, so now we're looking at around 35% of forest professionals and small woodland owners believe that climate change is a threat to them personally. So now getting into some sociocultural influences like values. And so we have the first value, caring for the environment, with forest professionals in green and small woodlot owners in blue. And then we have the mean response score. So this was a 1 to 5. This is the mean from both groups. So we see here that small woodlot owners have significantly higher values related to the environment. So we call these biospheric values or biocentric values. But again, those caring for the environment values are high among both stakeholder groups, followed by caring for others. So those are, altruistic values. And then finally, the lowest would be caring for oneself. Barriers to adaptation. And so again, on the y-axis is the percentage of respondents, so 0 to 100, indicated that these were a barrier to adaptation, forest professionals in green and small woodlot owners in blue. And so we see that, we'll see a couple of things here. The first is that both groups ranked complexity of information high as a barrier to adaptation. We also have some differences between the groups. We see that small woodlot owners ranked lack of financial capital and lack of access to information as a barrier to adaptation. And so this is important because this could influence policy down the line, decision-making, how scientists and policymakers interact with stakeholders. And it also feeds into this idea of incentives. So what are some incentives that are favored to increase adaptation? And here we see some differences. We see that small woodlot owners tend to favor incentives that are financial, such as tax breaks or microgrants, more so than forest professionals favor those. We also see that forest professionals, on the other hand, tend to favor more social incentives, so green certification and social licensing, more than small woodlot owners, which makes sense here. And overall, we see the highest level of agreement that it would be an incentive for tax breaks and green certification. So we also asked about management strategies that they would be willing to implement or to advise upon. And so this is a bit busy here, but we can see a couple of trends stand out. We have small woodlot owners on the top bars, and forest professionals are the bottom bars. The blue tones are willing, whereas the brown tones are not willing. And so we see a high level of willing to carry out management strategies such as thinning trees out of overlay dense forests, improving road and culvert maintenance, promoting diversity with different age stands and species diversity and stand level diversity. And then when we get to the right at the bottom, we're seeing less willingness to do management strategies that have higher levels of uncertainty. And so here we see the bottom, change timing of core forest operations to reduce negative environmental impacts. So this is less favored. as well as guiding changes in forest composition to meet expected future conditions. And this is something explicitly related to climate change. And so this is just to point out that there are some significant differences between stakeholder groups. Particularly, forest professionals are more willing to improve road and culvert maintenance and improve forest inventory methods compared to small woodlot owners. So there were some slight differences among two management options, but the rest, there were no significant differences between the two groups. So some of the key takeaways from all of this. Climate change risk perceptions overall are high in both forestry professionals, or those working in commercial lands, as well as with small woodlot owners. Also of note here is we saw that both groups perceived an impact more so than they perceived a threat currently. So this might indicate that those stakeholders are not thinking about climate change as a threat per se. We've seen this in other studies as well. Some of them see climate change also as an opportunity. We also might think about this in terms of they're perceiving it as an impact or a threat further on, so say 50 years into the future versus now. Also, we see that perceptions of self-efficacy are low, which is similar to other studies that have been conducted among US foresters. And so this is indicating that a lot of forest stakeholders don't know what adaptation efforts to make to address climate change, or find that information is too complex to address climate change or not relevant for them. So there are a lot of studies that have looked at this sort of thing. Finally, we see that there are some management strategies that forest stakeholder groups are highly willing to do, including targeting invasives, increasing diversity, improving roads, but less so guiding changes for the future. But we need to remember that a lot of those strategies, targeting invasives and increasing diversity or improving roads, all do increase the adaptive capacity of the forest to respond to climate change. When we think about some communication implications, so the forestry professionals or those working in commercial lands, we might think about framing adaptation in terms of the public's preferences, given their high agreement about market incentives. So they're interested in what the public thinks about what they're doing on their land. Small woodlot owners, we might think about addressing their self-efficacy and their lack of financial capacity in terms of how we discuss climate change adaptation. Also, they indicated that they would like more opportunities for learning from others. And given their smaller self-efficacy, increasing opportunities for social learning might be an option to get small woodlot owners in the same room, talking to each other and sharing knowledge about adaptation. We also see there might be some opportunity for financial incentives or cost share programs. Thinking about both groups together, complexity of information was a top barrier for both groups. So we need to think about how we can explain the complexity of climate change adaptation, but distill it into specific forest management strategies or concrete actions that they can do on their land. Also, given their high values for caring for the environment, their high environmental values, framing climate change as a forest and wildlife health concern might get a lot of people on board with climate change adaptation strategies without necessarily talking about it as climate change. Future direction. So there are some things that we would still like to do, and we would like, it'd be great if other people could think about these future directions as well in their own research. So one of the major things we think about is distilling the complexity of climate change information into just clear and digestible recommendations for forest managers. And this has come up in this survey, this has come up in other surveys as well as interviews that we've conducted with different forest stakeholders. Also, it's really important that scientists, policymakers, all forest stakeholders continue to engage in these conversations to address locally relevant adaptation options. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and adaptation needs to be discussed locally among those working on that land. Also, I just want to point out one of the limitations of this study. So forest stakeholder is very broad, and there's a lot of groups that we didn't survey. And it would be really important and helpful to assess the perceptions of other forest stakeholder groups. So those working in public lands, so land trusts, government officials, Forest Service, so all of those different forest stakeholder groups. And with that being said, we have recommendations for message frames, but we didn't actually evaluate the effectiveness of those different message frames. So doing a study where you test out the effectiveness of different message frames would be really helpful as well. We also need to think about the fact that communication is just one part of this process, which goes hand in hand with institutional support, so policy support, that enables forest stakeholders to conduct adaptation and good forest management on their land. So I want to thank both the Maine Woodlot Owners Association and UMaine's Cooperative Forestry Research Unit, both of those members, for taking the time to conduct this survey. We wouldn't have this information without their participation. This work was also supported by the USDA, AFRI, as well as Avangrid, and of course would not be possible without the University of Maine, the School of Forest Resources, and the Center for Research on Sustainable Forests. And so this article is currently available online. If you would like to get more information down below, you can access the full article, and I am happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.